Now to a Fox 5 exclusive, newly discovered and never before seen video of the king of rock and roll.
That's right. We've unearthed video from a trip that Elvis Presley took to New York City in 1956.
For decades, the world has known Elvis Presley as the king of rock and roll, a figure larger than life, wrapped in rhinestones, commanding the stage with a voice and presence that seemed almost supernatural. But rare footage and untold stories have surfaced, and they reveal something far more shocking. Elvis Presley was not always the myth the world remembers. Behind closed doors, behind the cameras, and in the most private of moments, he was someone very different. These glimpses, often hidden away in family collections or shared in whispers, strip away the legend and leave behind the man. They show Elvis laughing until his sides hurt, playing practical jokes on friends, singing gospel not for an audience but for himself. They show a man vulnerable, sometimes broken, who longed for a kind of peace he could never find on stage. The first revelation comes from family footage once thought too ordinary to matter. Elvis, barefoot in his living room at Graceland, is strumming a guitar while cousins and friends gather around. There are no spotlights, no screaming fans, just the sound of a man returning to the music that grounded him. His smile is wide, but his eyes give something away. Here was Elvis unmasked, living in the rare comfort of being just himself. Other stories reveal his childlike side. He was obsessed with games, football in the backyard, late-night rounds of Monopoly, water fights that turned Graceland's hallways into a playground. To his family, he wasn't just the king. He was a son, a cousin, a father who relished being silly and free when no one was watching. These moments, caught in rare footage and remembered by those closest to him, show a man desperate to hold on to normalcy in a life where everything was extraordinary. But it wasn't all joy. The same reels and memories capture moments that clash with the myth of invincibility. Elvis could be exhausted, his body showing the strain of endless tours and films. In one piece of footage, he sits slumped in a chair, listening quietly as friends joke around him. The sparkle is gone from his eyes, replaced by a heaviness that fans never saw. For his family, this was the Elvis they lived with, the one who carried the crushing weight of expectation and fame, even when the cameras weren't rolling. Priscilla once revealed that these rare glimpses were the hardest to watch. People think they knew him, she said, but they never saw the toll it took. The long nights, the loneliness, the pressure, it was always there, even when he smiled. Her words mirror what the footage shows. Elvis was human, fragile, and often haunted by the very crown he wore so proudly. There are also rare stories that capture his generosity in ways that still astonish. One relative recalls a night when Elvis called them unexpectedly, simply to ask if they were doing okay. He had everything the world could offer, yet he worried about whether his family had enough gas money to make it through the week. In private, his heart was enormous. He gave without hesitation, not for applause, but because he truly cared. And yet even this side of him was tinged with sadness. Those who knew him best said his generosity often came from a place of emptiness, a need to give because he couldn't always express what he felt. It was his way of reaching out, of connecting in a life where real connection was scarce. One particular piece of rare footage shook even lifelong fans. Elvis sitting at a piano in the middle of the night, playing a gospel hymn with tears streaming down his face. No stage, no band, no show, just raw emotion spilling into the keys. It revealed a man who turned to music not just as a performer, but as a refuge, a place to pour out the pain he kept hidden from the world. What these stories and clips prove is that Elvis Presley was not just the dazzling figure history remembers. He was a man of contradictions, playful yet burdened, generous yet lonely, powerful yet fragile. His family knew this side intimately, but the world is only now beginning to see it. And among the rarest of all the revelations is one that left even die-hard fans speechless. Because hidden in these private moments is a side of Elvis so unexpected, so deeply human, that it changes the way we understand him entirely. What that footage captured was not the king of rock and roll. It was Elvis Presley, the man. and the truth it revealed would forever rewrite the story of who he really was. The rare footage and family stories don't just pull back the curtain, they rip it away. Because what they reveal is an Elvis Presley the world never got to know. A man who, behind the cameras and away from the spotlight, lived with contradictions that even those closest to him struggled to reconcile. Some of the most revealing moments come from home movies taken at Graceland. Here was Elvis, not in a glittering jumpsuit, but in casual clothes, tossing a football in the yard with his cousins. His laugh was loud, his energy infectious. In those private moments, he wasn't the king of rock and roll. He was just Elvis, a southern boy from Tupelo who loved games, jokes, and competition. His family remembered how he could turn even the simplest gathering into an event, his charisma drawing everyone in without effort. Then there were the late-night sessions at the piano. Rare clips and memories tell of Elvis playing gospel into the early hours, surrounded by a small circle of friends and relatives. This was his sanctuary, his escape from the chaos of fame. Those nights weren't performances. They were prayers disguised as music. His voice, softer, more fragile than the roar of a concert, carried a kind of longing that only those who were there could ever truly understand. But alongside the playfulness and warmth, the rare footage also reveals moments of fragility that shatter the myth of invincibility. His family remembered the nights when exhaustion consumed him, when the sparkle in his eyes dimmed and he withdrew into silence. They recall how he would sometimes sit apart from the laughter, present in body but distant in spirit. For all the joy he could bring to others, there were nights when he could not find it for himself. Those close to him spoke of how his schedule, his fame, and his inner battles made life inside Graceland unpredictable. One moment he would be telling stories that had everyone doubled over in laughter. The next, his mood could darken without warning. The footage captured these contrasts. Scenes of joy and tenderness cut against glimpses of a man weighed down by a crown he never asked to wear. His daughter, Lisa Marie, would later recall how much she treasured the playful side of her father. To her, Elvis wasn't the icon the world worshipped. He was the dad who could make her laugh until her stomach hurt, the man who sang her to sleep, the one who spoiled her with affection. But even as a child, she sensed the tension. She remembered the sudden shifts in his mood, the times he seemed far away even when he was holding her close. Priscilla, too, has spoken about the private Elvis, the one who confided his fears when the cameras weren't around. He worried about letting his fans down, about becoming irrelevant, about losing the magic that had carried him from Tupelo poverty to worldwide stardom. These fears, rarely admitted publicly, shaped his private world. The man who could silence an arena with a single note was terrified of silence when it meant facing himself. And then there were the quirks, the little habits that made him human. His obsession with karate, practicing moves in the living room at odd hours. His love of practical jokes, hiding behind doors to startle friends. His strange eating routines, often sending out for peanut butter and banana sandwiches in the middle of the night. These oddities, captured in stories and clips, showed that even the king had his eccentric comforts. The family says these glimpses are important because they balance the image of Elvis the world consumed. He was not just the performer frozen in rhinestones and sweat-soaked photographs. He was a man who longed for laughter, for prayer, for simplicity. And yet, beneath it all, he carried a fragility that no amount of fame could fix. Because while the footage shows the warmth of Elvis at play and the tenderness of Elvis in prayer, it also reveals the cracks that fame carved into him. The cameras might have captured his smile, but they could not conceal the shadows gathering just beyond the frame. And it's in those shadows where the most haunting revelations waited, not in the footage itself, but in the stories the family carried silently for decades. Stories that would one day reveal the secrets Elvis never wanted the world to see. For years, Elvis Presley's family carried secrets the world was never meant to hear. Out of loyalty, out of love, and sometimes out of fear, they kept silent. They wanted the world to remember the king of rock and roll, not the man who often struggled just to keep himself together. But eventually, those truths surfaced. not to tarnish his memory, but to explain the man behind the legend. One of the most guarded realities was Elvis's dependence on pills. His family had seen it from the inside, long before whispers reached the public. They remembered how he relied on stimulants to stay awake for grueling schedules, then turned to sedatives to sleep, creating a cycle that wore down both his body and his spirit. In private, they watched the mood swings, the bursts of energy followed by stretches of exhaustion. For them, it wasn't the myth of a rock star burning too brightly. It was the painful side of a man they loved losing control of his own life. Priscilla has spoken about how powerless she often felt. She described watching him battle demons she couldn't reach, trying to help him without tearing him apart in the process. His volatility made their marriage a storm of contradictions. Affection and tenderness one moment, distance and despair the next. She admitted that she tried to shield Lisa Marie from the worst of it, but children see more than parents realize. Lisa Marie herself, years later, would confess the weight of growing up as Elvis's daughter. She adored her father, treasured his humor and warmth, but she also felt the confusion of living with a man who was both larger than life and heartbreakingly fragile. She spoke about the burden of inheriting his struggles, about how his restless spirit left a mark on her own life. To her, Elvis was both hero and warning, a man she loved deeply but could never fully understand. His cousins and extended family remembered moments that revealed his aching loneliness. They told of nights when Elvis would call them unexpectedly, sometimes in the middle of the night just to talk. Those calls weren't about business or music, they were about connection. Even surrounded by adoring fans and hangers-on, Elvis often felt profoundly alone. The family understood that the gifts he gave, the cars, the jewelry, the houses, were more than generosity. They were his way of buying closeness in a world where he feared everyone wanted something from him. But the most painful secret the family kept was Elvis's fear of being abandoned. It haunted his relationships, from Priscilla to the women who came after. Those who loved him said he could be fiercely possessive, terrified that people would leave him the way fame had taken his freedom. Yet his own choices, his affairs, his unpredictable behavior pushed people away, creating the very cycle he dreaded most. The family admits these contradictions were impossible to resolve. Elvis was a man who could fill a room with laughter, then retreat into silence without warning. He was a father who adored his daughter but was often absent when she needed him most. He was the king to millions, but privately confessed he felt like a prisoner in his own home. For decades, the Presley family chose to protect these truths. They feared the world would judge him harshly, that fans would see only the flaws and not the man. But as time passed, they realized the silence came at a cost. It painted Elvis as a myth, untouchable and perfect, when in reality, he was anything but. By finally speaking out, they hoped to show that his struggles didn't diminish his greatness. They explained it. Because the truth is, Elvis's genius and his torment were inseparable. The energy that electrified arenas was born from the same restless spirit that kept him awake at night. The generosity that made him beloved was tied to the emptiness he couldn't fill. The tenderness he showed Lisa Marie and those closest to him was all the more powerful because it came from a man who lived in constant fear of losing them. When tragedy struck the Presley family in later years, with the losses of Lisa Marie and Benjamin, the stories they had once hidden became impossible to keep inside. They realized that telling the world about Elvis's struggles was not betrayal. It was the only way to make sense of the man they loved. And those revelations changed everything. They showed that Elvis Presley wasn't just the king, he was a man who lived with pain, who fought battles no stage or audience could ever see, and who left scars on the very people who loved him most. But what the family revealed next wasn't just about Elvis's past. It was about the legacy they now carry and how those secrets still shape their lives today. When Elvis Presley's family finally broke their silence, they knew they were reshaping how the world saw him. For decades, Elvis had been frozen in time, forever the king, forever larger than life, forever untouchable. But their words, their rare stories, and their guarded truths revealed something more profound. They revealed that his legacy is not just about music or fame, it is about humanity, with all its brilliance and all its flaws. Priscilla, who spent her youth caught in the whirlwind of Elvis's rise, has said that telling the truth about him was not betrayal. It was love. To her, preserving his legacy didn't mean hiding his struggles. It meant showing the man who laughed, who cried, who doubted himself, and who fought battles no one could see. "You cannot understand the king without understanding Elvis the man," she explained. That simple statement reframed everything. Lisa Marie echoed this before her passing. She admitted that being Elvis's daughter was both blessing and burden, but she also believed that sharing the reality of his life could make his story resonate even more. "He wasn't perfect," she once said, "but that's what made him real. That's what made him mine." For fans who had spent their lives idolizing the myth, her words struck like lightning. Elvis wasn't diminished by being human. He was made more relatable, more timeless. The Presley grandchildren, too, found themselves caught in a legacy they never asked for. Graceland wasn't just a home, it was a museum, a shrine, a constant reminder of both glory and grief. For them, speaking about the private side of Elvis became a way to reclaim him as family. Not just a cultural icon, but a grandfather, a bloodline, a man whose struggles echoed through their lives. And for the world, these revelations did something extraordinary. They made Elvis more than a figure on a stage. They made him a man whose battles mirrored the same insecurities, fears, and longings that everyone carries. The rare footage, the family stories, the whispered truths, they stripped away the myth and left something even more powerful. A man whose humanity gave his music its soul. Fans who once believed they knew Elvis came to see him in a new light. The charisma, the generosity, the fire on stage, these were no longer seen as acts of perfection. They were seen as the triumphs of a man who was often broken, but still gave everything he had. His legacy, once guarded behind silence, was now richer, layered, and infinitely more human. The Presley family admits the choice to reveal these truths came with fear. They worried about how fans would react, whether Elvis's image would be damaged, whether the myth would shatter. But what they discovered was the opposite. Fans didn't turn away. They leaned closer. Because at the heart of it all, people didn't love Elvis only for the voice or the swagger. They loved him because he made them feel something. And knowing the struggles behind that feeling only deepened the connection. Priscilla has said she believes Elvis's story should serve as both inspiration and caution. Inspiration because his music, his passion, and his generosity touched the world in ways no one else has. Caution because fame, isolation, and silence can consume even the brightest souls. His family carries that lesson forward, not just for Elvis, but for themselves. And so, the Presley legacy is forever changed. No longer just the story of a king, it is the story of a man who lived in extremes. Glory and despair, joy and pain, triumph and tragedy. It is the story of a family who loved him deeply, suffered with him quietly, and now speaks for him honestly. In the end, Elvis's family gave him back to the world. Not as a myth, but as a man. And in doing so, they ensured that his legacy will endure. Not as something polished and distant, but as something raw, real, and unforgettable. Because Elvis Presley was never just the king of rock and roll, he was Elvis, human, flawed, extraordinary. And it is that truth, finally spoken, that will echo for generations. Elvis Presley's family has revealed the side of him the world never knew. Fragile, generous, broken, and unforgettable. Does this truth make his story more tragic, or does it make his brilliance even more inspiring? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more untold stories behind music's greatest legends.
There's all kinds of things like Elvis is still alive, and no one, not no one, but a lot of fans and all don't want to believe that he's hidden somewhere, that he's still alive. I wish he was still alive.
It began with a simple inventory check, one of those routine estate management tasks that usually leads nowhere. A mislabeled storage box from one of Graceland's off-site facilities. The kind of thing archivists expect to contain old receipts, maintenance logs, maybe a stack of outdated promotional materials. But the moment the lid was lifted, the room shifted. Inside was a smaller wooden container, sealed, its edges worn by time. And tucked inside that container, wrapped in a faded silk cloth, were letters, dozens of them, written in Elvis Presley's unmistakable looping script. For years, fans believed they knew every romantic chapter of Elvis's life. The public relationships, the whirlwind passions, the heartbreaks that became part of American mythology. But these letters were different from anything biographers had ever uncovered. They weren't addressed to Priscilla, Ginger, Linda, or any woman whose name had public significance. These were written to someone whose identity had never surfaced, a woman Elvis never mentioned in interviews, someone with no presence in the public timeline, someone hidden on purpose. The earliest letter stunned everyone who read it. Elvis wrote with a tenderness that cut deeper than the polished charm he offered the world. There was vulnerability in every line, an intimacy that didn't sound like the king speaking to an admirer. It sounded like a man writing to the one person who saw him without the spotlight framing his silhouette. He confessed exhaustion, loneliness, the heavy ache of being surrounded by people while feeling completely alone. And beneath those words was a longing that made one thing instantly clear. Whoever she was, she mattered to him in a way no one else did during that phase of his life. Archivists compared handwriting, ink age, and paper type, confirming that these letters were not fabrications. They were authentic, deeply personal, and written during a period when Elvis was struggling under the weight of fame and the expectations attached to his every move. These were years marked by brutal touring schedules, dissolving relationships, and the growing pressure of a legacy he felt slipping out of his control. Yet in these letters, he sounded like a man recalling glimmers of hope in the form of someone who understood him beyond the myth. The mystery intensified with each new envelope opened. Some letters were short, almost hurried, as if written in stolen moments between takes or performances. Others were longer, written with the kind of emotional clarity Elvis rarely allowed himself to express publicly. He didn't just write about affection, he wrote about trust, how rare it had become, how impossible it felt to lean on anyone without worrying they would leak his secrets or twist his vulnerability into profit. But to her, he opened the door he kept bolted for everyone else. Clues within the letters hinted at a connection that predated his final years. He referenced places he missed, conversations from earlier chapters of his life, moments too small and specific for a casual correspondence. The tone wasn't infatuation, it was recognition, as if he had rediscovered someone who reminded him of the man he used to be before the world sculpted him into an icon. Investigators noted something else. Elvis wrote these letters during periods when he was notoriously guarded, times when even close friends felt shut out. Yet here he was, not just writing, but confessing. He spoke about the exhaustion of performing strength, the pressure of maintaining a myth, and the ache of wanting authenticity in a world that rewarded illusion. What shocked researchers wasn't simply the romantic undertone, it was the honesty. This wasn't the polished Elvis shaped by publicity teams. This was the private Elvis, the man who rarely let anyone in. One detail kept resurfacing. He never addressed her by her full name. Only initials, only fragments, only hints that pointed nowhere definitive. It was as if he was protecting her even within the pages he never expected anyone else to see. And that secrecy deepened the question consuming everyone who held the letters. Why was she hidden? What made her so important and so dangerous to Elvis's public life that he kept her existence completely off the record? Then came the letter that changed everything. The one written late at night. Its ink darker, its tone heavier than all the others. A letter that didn't simply express longing or gratitude, but contained a confession, a revelation so personal, so startling, that the archivist who read it twice whispered, "This rewrites everything we thought we knew about him." And with that revelation, the mystery surrounding this woman shifted from curiosity to urgency. Because Elvis wasn't just writing love letters. He was writing to someone who held a truth he couldn't share with anyone else. As archivists examined more of the letters, a portrait of the mystery woman began to take shape. Not through direct descriptions, but through the emotional fingerprints Elvis left in every paragraph. He wrote to her as someone who understood him long before his world became blinding. Someone who didn't tremble in awe of his fame. Someone who wasn't impressed by the suits, the tours, the myth. His tone carried the familiarity of a man writing not to a fan or a fleeting romance, but to a presence anchored somewhere deep in his memory. Clues surfaced in subtle ways. He referenced an old diner outside Tupelo, a place he used to visit before music swallowed his life. He mentioned a conversation they once had by the window where the sun hit your hair just the same as it did when we were young. He spoke about missing the quiet we used to know, a quiet that no longer existed in the whirlwind Graceland had become. These weren't poetic flourishes. They were breadcrumbs pointing towards someone connected to a simpler chapter of his life. Historians began cross-referencing timelines, mapping out every woman Elvis was rumored to have known, every friend connected to his early years. Yet the details didn't match anyone from public record. This woman wasn't a forgotten celebrity or a backup singer or someone from the entourage. Her existence was conspicuously absent from every known biography. That absence became its own revelation. It meant Elvis had intentionally protected her. More letters appeared to be written during the mid-1970s, a period marked by exhaustion, strained relationships, and the kind of loneliness that settles on even the brightest stars. During this time, Elvis's friends described him as restless, searching for peace, aching for connection, but mistrustful of those around him. Yet in these letters, he sounded grounded, open, almost hopeful. He thanked her for listening, for reminding him of kindness when everything around him felt transactional. He wrote that her words steady me in ways the world never will. These letters didn't simply reveal affection, they revealed reliance. Investigators uncovered fragments of travel records and staff notes indicating that Elvis would vanish for a few hours at a time, occasions dismissed as spontaneous drives or late-night quiet time. But the timing of these disappearances lined up eerily well with the dates of certain letters. Some were written with the urgency of a man who had just seen someone and couldn't bear to wait to put thoughts on paper. Others carried a tone of regret, as though a planned meeting had been impossible to discreetly arrange. One detail stood out. He often apologized for being unable to visit her without drawing attention. He wrote about the burden of being watched, even in silence. "I can't walk through a door without someone turning it into a story," he said in one letter. "But you're the one place I want to walk into without the world following me." That sentiment, raw, stripped of the persona, underscored how rare this connection truly was. The letters also hinted at how they met or reconnected. One message reminisced about the night the music was too loud and you told me to stop pretending I enjoyed it. Another thanked her for not asking for a photograph when everyone else did. These lines painted a picture of someone who saw through the performance, someone who recognized the man behind the myth. Whether she knew him before fame or simply refused to treat him like a spectacle, she became the emotional refuge he desperately needed. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a new question emerged. If she mattered this deeply to Elvis, why didn't anyone in his inner circle mention her? Why was there no trace of her in interviews, tour documents, or security logs? That silence felt deliberate. Perhaps Elvis feared she would be engulfed by the publicity that consumed everyone near him. Perhaps she feared it too. Or maybe their connection lived in a space too fragile to be exposed, something they both protected by keeping it hidden from the world. And then the letters began shifting. The tone deepened. Elvis's writing became heavier, more reflective. He stopped speaking only of memories and began hinting at something they shared, something private, something the public was never meant to know. A secret tethered to both of them, buried beneath years of noise. The final letter in this section contained a line that froze every researcher who read it. "You know why I can't say your name out loud. If they knew what we carried, nothing would ever be the same." The letter's emotional center came in a paragraph written with aching clarity. Elvis confessed he was considering a major change, something that would shock everyone around him. He talked about stepping back from touring, distancing himself from certain people, maybe even leaving Graceland for a while. He described nights when he imagined disappearing to a quieter place, somewhere she could join him without reporters circling overhead. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where he could simply exist with her, without the crown weighing on every decision. But the tone shifted in the final third of the letter. Hope gave way to fear, as if he doubted whether he had the strength to do what he was contemplating. He wrote about the pressure closing in, about feeling watched, about decisions being made that didn't feel like his. He admitted he was afraid of becoming a stranger to himself. And then he acknowledged something even heavier. He feared that his silence might one day destroy the connection he valued most. The unsent letter ended with a confession that froze everyone who read it. "I never told the world about you because I wanted at least one part of my life to stay mine. But if something happens, if I can't protect what we've carried all these years, you must tell the truth, even if they never believe you." No signed name, no initials, just the weight of a truth Elvis never found the courage to speak aloud. And then, beneath his signature, a final line written in a hurried stroke. "They're making plans for me, plans I didn't agree to." It was the last letter he ever wrote to her, and the fact that he never mailed it raises the question that still haunts historians today. Was he protecting her, or was he warning her? The final letter in the box looked different from the rest. The paper was thinner, the folds sharper, as if Elvis had opened and closed it repeatedly, unsure whether to send it or bury it. The handwriting was slower, the lines tighter, the words chosen with the precision of someone who understood he was writing in the shadow of something inevitable. This letter wasn't a continuation of their ongoing conversation. It felt like a farewell written by a man who had run out of time. In it, Elvis didn't speak about escape or frustration. Instead, he wrote with a strange calm, acknowledging the toll the years had taken on him. He admitted he no longer knew which parts of his life belonged to him and which belonged to the machine surrounding him. Yet even in that exhaustion, he found a moment of clarity when he wrote to her, not as the superstar the world demanded, but as the man he still hoped she remembered. He thanked her for loving him without expectation, for holding on to the pieces of him that fame had scattered. He reminded her of the early days of their connection, when conversations lasted for hours and the world outside felt distant and unimportant. He wrote about the quiet strength she carried, a strength he had leaned on in ways no one else ever knew. And then he shifted, acknowledging the reason she had remained invisible within the story of his life. "You stayed in the shadows," he wrote, "not because you were unimportant, but because you mattered too much to risk losing to the noise." It was clear from his tone that their secrecy wasn't rooted in scandal. It was rooted in preservation. He feared that if the world discovered her, they would dissect her, attach rumors to her name, twist her presence into a narrative that neither of them deserved. He couldn't protect himself from the distortions of fame, but he could protect her, and he had done so fiercely. Investigators piecing together the timeline realized the truth. The woman never came forward because Elvis protected her identity, and she honored that protection long after he was gone. The silence wasn't guilt. It was loyalty. But the letter revealed something deeper. Elvis wrote about the uncertainty surrounding his final months. He sensed a shift in the people around him, a growing urgency, decisions being made without him, promises written in the language of business rather than care. He admitted he felt like he was being guided somewhere without being told why, a sentence that now chills anyone who reads it. He wasn't paranoid. He was observant. He saw the machinery closing in and recognized that his life was no longer his to steer. Yet even then, he didn't express resentment toward her. Instead, he gave her the only thing he had left to offer, the truth that he couldn't trust anyone else with. The final paragraphs carried a heartbreaking mixture of resignation and hope. Elvis wrote about longing for a life he never got to live, a quiet home, a slower rhythm, a chance to be a man instead of a monument. He spoke of wanting to sit beside her on a porch somewhere far from the stage lights, watching the world move at a pace that didn't devour him. It was a dream he had carried quietly, a dream the world never knew he cherished. And then, with a softness that reads almost like a whisper, he wrote, "If I leave this world before I find peace, I pray you remember that you were the closest I ever came to it." Those words reframed everything. They revealed that Elvis's greatest emotional anchor in his final years wasn't a public relationship, a career ambition, or the empire he built. It was this quiet, hidden connection. This woman who remained untouched by fame because she existed in the one place Elvis fought desperately to protect, the private corners of his heart. Why didn't she reveal the letters after his death? The answer lay between the lines. She understood that coming forward would distort everything he had tried to shield. Her silence wasn't an omission. It was devotion. She guarded his secret the same way he had guarded her identity. The discovery of these letters does more than rewrite Elvis's romantic history. It reshapes his legacy. Behind the glittering myth stood a man still searching for belonging, still yearning for connection, still trying to hold on to the slivers of humanity fame kept stripping away. And in these letters, for the first time, we meet that man fully, not as the king, but as Elvis Aaron Presley, writing his heart onto paper for the only person who knew him without the crown. If these letters changed how you see Elvis, share your thoughts below. Do you believe this mystery woman was his truest love, or the final piece of his untold story? Comment your theory and subscribe for more emotional, hidden chapters from the lives of iconic stars.
This is a song that I just recorded, and it's an old song called Unchained Melody. I had to play the piano, so it'll take just a second.
The last night of Elvis Presley's life didn't look like a tragedy waiting to unfold. It looked ordinary, quiet, almost routine. But everyone inside Graceland felt something different in the air. A heaviness they couldn't name, a stillness that didn't match the usual late-night energy of a house that rarely slept. People later described it as a mood they sensed more than understood, the kind that settles into the walls before anyone realizes something irreversible is already in motion. Elvis moved through the house that night with a softness that caught people off guard. Not weak, not tired, simply distant, as though he were listening to a voice no one else could hear. Ginger Alden noticed it first, the way he paused in doorways, the way his eyes lingered on familiar rooms as if he were revisiting memories rather than moments. She later said, "It didn't feel like a goodbye, but it didn't feel like a normal night either." Earlier in the evening, he'd cracked a few light jokes. Nothing strange, nothing dramatic. He smiled, made a comment about needing to get better rest, promised he'd be up again soon. On the surface, it sounded like the Elvis everyone knew, pushing forward, trying to keep up appearances even when the world behind the scenes felt unsteady. But there was something in his voice, a quietness that didn't match the words coming out of his mouth. His bodyguard later recalled a brief exchange in the hallway, a moment he'd replay countless times. Elvis approached him casually, but his tone held a seriousness that cut through the usual late-night small talk. He said something simple, something the bodyguard didn't fully grasp at the time, a remark that felt reflective rather than conversational, a line that now reads like the beginning of a man trying to make peace with pieces of his life no one else knew he was carrying. The bodyguard admitted that at the time, he brushed it off as fatigue. Only later did he understand how much weight sat beneath those few words. Others in the house noticed the shift, too. Elvis spent more time sitting quietly, less time pacing or planning the next day's activities. He seemed deep in thought, but not troubled, more like someone preparing himself for something he couldn't quite articulate. He walked Ginger through the little memories, small stories from years past, moments he hadn't spoken about in ages. She later described it as a kind of emotional drifting, like he was touching parts of his life he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. When Elvis told her he was going to read in the bathroom for a while, nothing about the sentence seemed alarming. It was something he had done hundreds of times. But she remembered the way he said it. Not rushed, not distracted. Calm. Too calm. As if he needed that quiet moment more than he could explain. He promised he'd be back soon. He promised they'd continue planning the next day. She believed him. His final public words that night were ordinary. A polite laugh. A gentle reassurance. The kind of small interaction millions of people assumed Elvis lived on. But newly resurfaced accounts from staff paint a different picture. There was another set of final words, private ones, spoken when he thought no one was paying attention. According to one longtime employee, just minutes before heading upstairs, Elvis murmured something that stopped them cold. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't poetic, it wasn't a farewell, but it carried a tone that didn't sound like a man expecting tomorrow. It sounded like someone acknowledging a fear he had kept buried for too long. The employee admitted he didn't understand what Elvis meant in that moment. The phrasing was unclear. The intent wasn't obvious, but the uneasiness it caused stayed with him for decades. What makes these final words so haunting is how ordinary they appeared until everything went wrong. Each person who saw him that night carries a version of the same memory. Elvis wasn't distressed, but he was different. There was clarity in his eyes that didn't match the exhaustion in his body. A sense of reflection that didn't belong to a man preparing for another day. A soft weight behind each sentence, as if he'd already begun letting go of something he couldn't name. When Elvis walked upstairs for the last time, no one thought they were witnessing a final chapter. No one understood that the subtle shift in his voice, the reflective comments, the quiet heaviness in the house were all warning signs wrapped in calm. And yet, the moment he disappeared behind that doorway, several people later admitted they felt something in their chest tighten, a feeling they couldn't explain. Because Elvis Presley's final words that night didn't sound like goodbye, but they didn't sound like tomorrow either. In the weeks leading to that final night, the people closest to Elvis said his emotions seemed to swing between determination and exhaustion. He wasn't collapsing under fame. He had lived with that weight for decades. What unsettled everyone was how reflective he had become, as if he were trying to sort his entire life into two piles, what he could still fix and what he feared he had already lost. There were nights when he seemed lighter, speaking about future shows, new musical ideas, and even travel plans he wanted to make. He talked about getting healthier, about taking control again, about proving he wasn't done. But those bursts of enthusiasm always came with another side. Quiet moments when he stared off, his mind clearly drifting toward thoughts he couldn't bring himself to voice openly. Friends noticed he was talking more about the past than the future. He revisited memories from his early touring years, times when the music felt pure and the pressure hadn't yet hardened into something cold and unrelenting. He mentioned people he hadn't spoken about in years, friends from childhood, musicians he admired, old mentors who had shaped him long before the world crowned him its king. It wasn't nostalgia. It was as though he was reaching for pieces of himself that had scattered across the timeline of his life. One evening, while sitting with a close friend, Elvis slipped into a conversation that stayed with the man for decades. He admitted he didn't feel in control anymore, not of his health, not of his schedule, not even of the relationships inside his own home. They mean well, he'd said, but sometimes I feel like they're planning my life without asking me if I'm still living it. It wasn't bitterness, it was fatigue. A confession from a man who had built an empire only to find himself boxed in by the walls he never meant to create. This wasn't the only moment when Elvis allowed the mask to slip. A member of his security team recalled walking into the kitchen late one night to find Elvis sitting alone, staring at a cup of tea he hadn't touched. When the guard asked if everything was all right, Elvis gave a faint smile and said he was just thinking too much. But when pressed, he added a sentence the guard wished he'd understood then. Sometimes I wonder what part of me is left that's really mine. Those who loved him tried to reassure him, but Elvis wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for clarity, something solid to hold on to, while the world seemed determined to spin around him faster than he could keep up. Ginger Alden recalled a moment in the early morning when Elvis seemed unusually present, as though he were finally seeing the room instead of moving through it on autopilot. He sat beside her, not with the restless energy that often carried him through sleepless nights, but with a calm weight that didn't match the strain he had been under. He held her hand and told her he would return soon, but she noticed he said it in a tone that carried more meaning than the words allowed. It didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like something he needed her to believe. A member of the Memphis Mafia later shared that Elvis had spoken to him briefly in the hallway before heading back to his room. The conversation itself was ordinary, something small about plans for the next day. But then Elvis paused, lowered his voice, and said something the man would never forget. His words weren't dramatic, but they were strangely final. He said he was going to try to rest because he needed the strength for what's coming. At the time, the man assumed Elvis meant the upcoming tour. Only later did he realize those words felt heavier than any schedule. Another account came from someone who saw Elvis near the staircase shortly after that. He leaned against the banister, eyes distant but calm, and whispered to himself, "I've got to get myself together." Not as a performer preparing for a comeback, not as a star rallying for a show, but as a man confronting a private battle no one else could fight with him. The witness said Elvis didn't look scared. He looked determined, as if he were trying to gather the version of himself he wanted to be. One last time. What happened next became the final private moment of his life. Ginger later described how Elvis stood in the doorway of the room, looking back at her with a softness that made her feel he was carrying something unsaid. She asked if he was okay. He nodded. Then he gave her a look she'd never forget, half gratitude, half burden, and said the last words she would ever hear from him, "I won't be long." They were supposed to be simple. They weren't supposed to mean anything. But in hindsight, those 4 words sounded like someone trying to convince himself more than her. Someone who sensed his body was faltering in ways he hadn't shared. Someone who knew rest might not be enough this time. Ginger said the tone of his voice stayed with her long after she realized he wouldn't be coming back down. Another recollection emerged years later from a staff member who heard something through the door as Elvis walked into the bathroom. A quiet mutter, too soft to fully decipher, but the final phrase was clear. Something isn't right. Those 3 words, dismissed at the time as exhaustion, have become one of the most haunting fragments of his final hour. In the days that followed his passing, stories of that last night surfaced in pieces, each one offering a different window into the truth. Some remembered his determination. Others remembered the fragility in his voice. Yet they all agreed on one thing. Elvis carried a sense of awareness that night, an understanding of something shifting inside him. Whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, he felt it. And that brings us to the most controversial account, the one shared quietly years later by someone who had guarded Elvis fiercely. This person claimed Elvis had pulled him aside earlier that evening and confessed a thought that made little sense at the time, a sentence whispered with the weight of realization. "I think my time's running out." He didn't say it dramatically. He didn't frame it as fear. It sounded like acceptance, like a man who had spent years ignoring the signs, finally allowing himself to speak the truth. But here's the detail that unsettled everyone who heard it. He said those words calmly, as if he wasn't warning someone else, as if he was finally admitting it to himself. And yet, even that wasn't the last thing Elvis was heard saying, because according to one account, the final whispered words he spoke just before he walked out of sight weren't about fear or regret or pain. They were about someone he believed he had let down. And that revelation changes the entire meaning of his final night. In the days after Elvis passed, Graceland felt suspended in a grief too heavy to name. People moved through the hallways in slow, uncertain steps, speaking in softer tones, afraid of breaking whatever fragile calm remained in the house. Yet beneath the shock and mourning was something else, an unspoken understanding that the conversations from his final night carried meanings no one had been ready to face. Elvis's last private remarks weren't dramatic proclamations or cryptic puzzle pieces. They were reflections of a man who had been trying, quietly and desperately, to be heard. The people who knew his final words kept them close for a long time. Some felt sharing them would distort his legacy, turning his last hours into speculation rather than remembrance. Others held them back out of guilt, unsure whether those words were meant for the world or meant as confessions whispered into the dark. And a few simply couldn't bear to repeat them because doing so meant admitting they had missed the signs he'd tried to give them. As stories emerged over the years, a pattern formed. Elvis's last words, spoken to different people in different tones, weren't about fear of death. They were about burden, responsibility, and a sense of unfinished business weighing on him more heavily than anyone realized. He wasn't worried about his legacy. He was worried about the people he believed he had let down, the fans he felt he'd disappointed during difficult performances, the friends he feared he'd pushed away with the demands of superstardom, the loved ones he worried he'd failed by not taking better care of himself. His final whispers didn't come from panic. They came from conscience. One confidant admitted that Elvis spoke softly about wanting one more chance to get things right. Not a farewell, not a resignation, a hope that tomorrow would give him an opportunity to reclaim the parts of himself he felt slipping away. But the weight of those words only became clear after the news broke, when the man replayed that sentence again and again, realizing the quiet urgency behind it was something he had brushed aside in the moment. Another person revealed that Elvis's final private remark, the one spoken right before he disappeared down the hallway, carried a tenderness that didn't fit the heavy mood of the house. He mentioned someone he felt he hadn't treated as kindly as they deserved, someone who had stood by him even when he had nothing left to give. The remark wasn't long. It wasn't poetic, but it carried regret, gratitude, and something deeper, a wish for forgiveness he hadn't found the courage to ask for directly. For decades, these accounts stayed buried beneath layers of myth, speculation, and public fascination with the tragedy of his death. Those who held the truth believed they were protecting him, protecting his privacy, protecting the memory of his strength, protecting fans from the haunting vulnerability he carried in those final hours. They feared his last words would be twisted into sensational headlines or misinterpreted as predictions rather than reflections of a man searching for meaning in the shadows of his life. But as time passed, the silence around those words began to feel heavier than the words themselves. People closest to him began admitting that his final comments were not signs of imminent doom, but signs of a man who still cared deeply, perhaps more deeply than anyone realized, about the world he was about to leave behind. Elvis wasn't giving up. He wasn't forecasting his own end. He was speaking like someone who wanted more time to heal the cracks he felt responsible for. And when those closest to him finally came forward, they did so not to sensationalize his death, but to remind the world that Elvis Presley was not simply an icon who burned too bright. He was a man constantly fighting to reconcile the myth with the human being inside it. His final words reflect that battle more honestly than any biography ever has. They show a man who loved deeply, who wanted forgiveness, who hoped for redemption, and who feared he had waited too long to grasp either. In the end, his last whispered sentence, spoken quietly, almost apologetically, captures the emotional essence of his final night. He wasn't saying goodbye. He was asking for one more tomorrow. And that haunting truth reshapes the story not of how Elvis Presley died, but of how desperately he still wanted to live. If Elvis's final words changed how you see his last hours, share your thoughts below. Do you believe he sensed what was coming? Or was he simply carrying emotional weight no one understood? Comment your theory and subscribe for more powerful, hidden truths behind the world's most iconic stars.